Welcome, everybody. You are, if you didn't realize this already, you are in session 9A, which is focused on individual papers on rugs and carpets. So welcome, everybody, and we've got some great speakers here, and we'll kind of just jump in. So without further ado, I think we'll start, and our first speaker is going to be James Turner, and the title of his talk is Ayineh, the Mirror of Persian Carpet Designs. Welcome, James.
Thanks so much. The theme of the conference is hidden stories, hidden lives. And my interest has been in the social context and meaning content of Persian carpet designs. So this has led to a study of the symbolism of carpet designs, and the metaphysics, the philosophy that lies behind these designs. This inevitably leads into discussion of the symbolism of carpet designs. And this has not been a popular subject in the 20th century. The Western understandings of Persian carpet designs have emphasized their decorative and aesthetic qualities. Research and curatorial concerns have focused on technical questions of materials, weaving methods, precise origins, and datings. Historical and ethnological interest has been recognized, of course, but the possibility that many designs communicate personal motivations and social values has been relatively neglected. I can give you some quotes from some of the standard references of the 20th century. The dominant approach was set by J.K. Mumford in the pioneering work Oriental Rugs, published in 1901. I quote from him: "In their maze of designs is a symbol language, the key of which, in its ceaseless transmission through the centuries, has been unhappily all but lost." That states it rather clearly. Jumping ahead 50 years to the classic book, The Persian Carpet by A.C. Edwards, he concludes that contemporary designers were motivated by, and I quote, "delight in symmetry and beauty, but no more." That's a rather categorical statement. He also writes that during his years in Iran, he never heard any reference to symbolism in carpet designs. We have to refer to the monumental A Survey of Persian Art, published 1937-38 by Arthur Upham Pope and Phyllis Ackerman. Pope characterizes the genius of Iranian visual art throughout history as a non-representational art of decoration. He describes current carpet production as more industry than art, and he dismissed it from aesthetic or intellectual evaluation. Coming a little further along in time, P.R.J. Ford in The Oriental Carpet, published in 1981, he says, "What matters is whether a carpet design works as a design," and this is a direct quotation, "the whole principle of attaching meaning or symbolism to the motifs is highly suspect." So you see what we're up against. These authors, and many others, fail to recognize that there are different conventions of art and communication within Iranian culture. T.S. Eliot has a good line: "We had the experience, but we missed the meaning." I'm going to claim that within a more sympathetic and comprehensive understanding, Persian carpet designs express a profound ethical vision originating in metaphysical philosophy, folk beliefs, and religion. They provide strong evidence for Wittgenstein's challenging claim that aesthetics and ethics are the same. I'm going to focus fairly narrowly on the symbolism of the mirror, Ayineh, which has been a resonant image and theme in the long history of Iranian culture. There's a well-known hadith, maybe the most famous hadith, which is a traditional saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which accounts for the mystery of the creation of the universe. Allah says, "I was a hidden treasure, and I desired to be known." The word Khoda for Allah in Farsi has the original meaning comes from self, or even created from nothing. It follows that all of creation should be viewed as a way for the divine to be revealed. In the philosophy of Neoplatonism, a key concept is the mirrored universe, often stated as above, so here below. At least ideally, the world was to be seen and experienced as a mirror image of the divine pattern. We can go back much further in time to prehistory. The mythical Shah Jamshid ruled with the help of a magical bowl, the Jam-e-Jam, in which he could see everything in his kingdom reflected. We should recall that to reflect on a problem is to examine it closely and consider other possibilities. And to consider has the root meaning of bringing our thoughts into alignment with the stars and the divine pattern they reveal. The word for star in Farsi is sitare, the same word, and it's at the root of the word consider. At a different imaginative level, close friends are commonly said in Iranian popular culture to be mirrors of each other. Our true selves are revealed or reflected in our interactions with others. I could quote from Rumi, the 13th century metaphysical poet, who was inspired by his profound friendship with Shamsi Tabrizi. He wrote, "I see my beauty in you." We reveal ourselves in our interactions with others. Let me talk about maybe the most famous mirror in Iranian literature. In the mystical work, The Conference of the Birds by Attar, more than 800 years ago, the story describes the arduous physical, mental, and spiritual journey of 30 birds, see more, 30 birds. At a time of social dislocations and constant dangers, they nervously embark on an uncertain quest to discover their true king, the Simorgh. One bird, the hudhud, plays a special role as their messenger and guide. The hudhud is the crested hoopoe, for those of you who know birds. The hudhud encourages the other birds to overcome all the challenges and complete the journey. The legend culminates in a transforming revelation. Their king is a mirror, an Ayineh in which the 30 birds see themselves reflected. By persevering, they have reached the final understanding that their 7-stage pilgrimage has been a journey to a new self-awareness. And here I'm going to show you a Bakhtiari carpet. I have to show it this way, my technical resources are rather limited. But what I want you to see is the 2 birds in the design. The vase is also a Sufi symbol, but the 2 birds. And you have to take my word for it. That is the hudhud. The hudhud is recognized by a crest. It's called the crested hoopoe, a crest of feathers on its head. And I understand that this is not terribly visible, but you take my word for it. This is the crested hoopoe. And actually, what we're seeing is the hudhud looking at its reflection. It's gazing peacefully at its reflection, which indicates it's contemplating its double nature of matter and spirit. I think we can reasonably conclude from that the creators of the design intended to convey a message. Viewers, we are being encouraged to look into the same mirror. Following the wise rule and the guidance of the hudhud, we will learn to contemplate our dual nature of matter and spirit. And going on to another carpet, which is rather simple. I have a not very good image of it here. This is made in Ferdous, about 1970, I would say. It's woven entirely in undyed white, brown, gray, and black wool. So this is intended to communicate a message of simplicity. At first glance, it's a fairly unremarkable interpretation of the medallion and cornice design. But if you look at it for more than a few seconds, look at the white field. And what does that remind you of? Most viewers, after a bit of resistance, see an animal skin. And that is the intention here. This is an animal skin. And the question then is, why is the animal skin there? And the animal skin in Farsi is the pustin. And the pustin was one of the few possessions of the wandering dervishes. I'm going to say dervish, which is the Persian pronunciation. They had a kashkul, the begging bowl, the tabar, the ritual axe, and an undyed wool cloak, and almost always a pustin, an animal skin. And there is a proverbial saying that indicates the importance of the symbolic importance of the pustin. A dervish who owned more than could be covered by his animal skin was said to be forgetful of Allah. So it was very identified with the way of life of the dervish. And you may know that the most common spiritual exercise of the wandering dervishes was the repetition of a short phrase like a mantra. It was called the Zikr Allah, the remembrance of God. The most common one was Yahu. This is before the internet. It means, oh, he. Or Ya Ali, Ya Hussein, Ya Hassan, or Ya Haq, oh, truth. Repeated countless times, it produced a forgetful state of mind where only Allah was present to the consciousness of the dervish. By constantly repeating his zikra, the dervish was said to be polishing his heart. This should be understood as a poetic metaphor and not as biology. The dervish constantly polished his inner essence until it became a flawless mirror, an Ayineh that perfectly reflected the divine pattern. So if we interpret the field as the animal skin, the pustin, which represents the dervish, certainly the way of life of the dervish, then we have to give an interpretation to the medallion. And the medallion is the inner essence of the dervish, polished to become a perfect mirror that flawlessly reflects the divine pattern. To reinforce this interpretation, you can see the form of the medallion is sometimes called the eight-pointed star, but I think more meaningfully the double square. It's formed in a very elementary way by two overlapping squares. And this is the primary symbol in Sufism of the inner penetration of matter and spirit. And actually, the double square medallion symbolizes the union of all dualities in the divine essence. So it is an image of the divine in this interpretation. And let me go on to another carpet. And here I'm going to show the illustration from the book that I co-authored. This is an imaginative abstract vision of a Persian garden. And the most prominent feature of the design, I think you'll agree, is the central hose mahi, the fish pool that should be present in the ideal garden. It silently indicates the presence of a concealed source of water, the essential element for the continuance of life. The pool here is large enough to have a small island with a meaningful double square at its center. That's probably not even visible. This special resting place welcomes all visitors. It serves as a physical and mental refuge where they may tranquilly contemplate the beauty of the surrounding garden. And Persian gardens have a dual nature. When they're visited during the day, the garden is a golistan, a place of flowers. At night, it is experienced differently as a bustan, a place of scents. In this suggestive way, every Persian garden leads visitors to contemplate the dualities of light and dark, sight and vision, substance and essence. When the garden is visited in the dark stillness of night, a cloudless night preferably, the hose mahi, the fish pool, is magically transformed into an ayineh. When the pool is completely motionless, it becomes a perfect mirror that reflects the divine pattern revealed in the planets and the stars. The fish pool plays the same role as the central medallion in the classic medallion and corner design. By ordinary means, the garden design succeeds in bringing the cosmic pattern to earth. Like the heart or inner essence of the dervish, the hose mahi of the ideal Persian garden becomes a polished mirror that reflects divine truth. This is a Ayineh carpet by a very, very famous designer Habibian. And it represents the dome of a mosque, doesn't it? It's an incredibly fine carpet, far more than 1 million knots per square meter, and tremendous effort. I would date it to about 1970. And let me just talk about it. The Ayineh carpet by the master designer Fatollah Habibian represents the dome of a mosque. In symbolic terms, any dome design is to be conceived as an idealized image of the sky or heaven descended to earth. If we adopt the language of Neoplatonism, we may say of this design that ideal form has entered a material thing. In this ancient philosophy that has been a major influence on Sufism, a material object becomes beautiful to the extent it participates in and embodies the divine thought. That is the fundamental reason why the visible beauty of material things may be used to contemplate the invisible divine beauty. Since the time is becoming short, I'm going to have to skip over, very regretfully, a very beautiful carpet. But this is a carpet made by another master designer, Mowgli. It's a Mashhad carpet. I would date it to about 1910. And again, it's a medallion and cornice design, a rather sublime example of that, I would say. To state the obvious, it is a brilliant interpretation of the conventional medallion and cornice design. On first impression, it is not difficult to imagine this carpet functioning very well as an opulent display of great wealth and power. Reza Shah Pahlavi seems to have agreed. He is believed to have acquired the production from the Mowgli workshop for his palaces after consolidating power in the 1920s. However, in view of the ideas developed very sketchily here, we may begin to experience an almost complete reversal from this immediate interpretation of the meanings of this design. This reversal will come when we have reached some understanding of its deeper motivations. Perhaps we should be reminded of Hamlet's words of advice to the players. The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. By now we recognize that the red field of the design is an idealized vision of a pustine, the animal skin of the wandering dervish. The most beautiful medallion is a sublime representation of the inner essence of the dervish. After endless polishing during the trials of the spiritual journey, his heart has become a flawless mirror that reflects only the divine pattern. The inner medallion has the form of the double square, which symbolizes the union of all dualities in a comprehensive awareness. And the full medallion is shaped in a dynamic way by a doubling of the double square. By this elementary method, its form more closely approaches a perfect circle, which is a primary symbol of the divine unity. Yeah. In the timeless philosophy that led to the creation of this design, the entire Persian carpet functions most meaningfully as a mirror held up to nature. It encourages all viewers to examine critically the conditions of their existence and seek to live within human limits. More than a symbol of power for the king, the Mowgli design is a symbol of powerlessness and submission before the divine majesty. We should remember that the word Islam means submission. The design creates beauty. The Mashhad carpet far transcends the limitations of its transient material form to physically embody and visibly display the eternal essence of the world. It has a very ambitious meaning. The design has been revealed as an Ayineh that allows us to see ourselves as we truly are. It will eventually communicate this unmistakable image, this unmistakable message to all who have remained spiritually aware. Responsive viewers, and even the king, will listen to the promptings of conscience that the design inspires. Like the dervish, they will seek to discover the creative simplicity needed to embody and display divine truth. I quoted Wittgenstein as saying that aesthetics and ethics are the same. And I think this is the primary meaning of the Mochi design and many others. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, James. Our next speaker will be Felix Vandenbelt, and the title of his paper is Ties That Bind the Daily Lives of Carpet Traders. Welcome, Felix.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Felix from the Netherlands. I did a university master's on cultural anthropology. I wrote an ethnography on the carpet trade of Iran, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. I would now share my screen. So on August 6, 2019, international economic sanctions on Iran were reintroduced. At the time I was traveling through the region. I was hitchhiking and trading carpets with friends. Through that process, I became interested with these traders. And especially during that time in August, I heard a lot about their stories on sanctions. And I became interested in that aspect of the trade. Obviously, sanctions have devastating effects on people's lives. Not just the carpet trade. People cannot buy a car or meat. But amongst other aspects of life, these sanctions also affected the lives of carpet traders in the region. I was interested in how they trade carpets in the context of sanctions, and how they find interesting ways in doing business on a local level. And data on trade and the effects of sanctions on the daily lives of carpet traders and of people in general in Iran are scarce, as the Iranian government does not promote research. However, statistics tell us that carpet trade between the Western world and Iran in general has plummeted. Despite all that, I still saw traders willing to do trade, even some people that went back to Iran and started new carpet businesses, as they were still able to use their global networks, although in informal ways, mostly through neighboring countries, through which they were traded, mostly Turkey and Kuwait. So yeah, after my travels, I came back to Iran to use my business contacts to do a research of approximately half a year. And I will only focus on Iran in my talk, because I think that's the most interesting. Yeah, as I said, I wrote an ethnography on the everyday lives of carpet traders in Iran, the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. As an anthropologist, I was interested in how these traders dealt with their situation. In that, I was not only interested in their survival tactics, but I was also exploring how the everyday lives of carpet traders are embedded in other life domains outside the economical. I wanted to do that to bring nuance to their lives, especially in the context of globalization, the globalization of carpet trade, and economic sanctions. In doing this, my research contributes to the understanding of global trade networks from the perspective of the Iranian carpet trader living in Iran or in Europe. In anthropology, this is called globalization from below. Seeing the lives of carpet traders in this manner allowed me to recognize the varying levels at which trading processes unfold through routes, practices, and strategies. So yeah. Now I want to say something about my personal position, my research in Iran, and the globalization from below. My position is that of a traveler, a business person, and later also researcher. As I said, research in Iran is problematic, so I mostly introduce myself as a trader. The people that are included in this research all agreed with that. Sanctions in Iran also affect safety of research and, most importantly, of the people that participate in it. Therefore, these people are not recognizable. The context of globalization from below. In this context, the carpet acts as a commodity that plays an intermediate role between trading networks. because the social conditions that people attribute to the circulation of goods, such as carpets, are derived from human transactions, their motivations across countries, languages, trust, and social and cultural institutions. These social conditions entail unwritten contracts and moral obligations, and carpet traders often, in doing so, act as diplomats, negotiating ties between different ethnicities, countries, and languages. Examining these social conditions reveals how carpet traders' networks are maintained by a fine line between trust and betrayal. These observations all add to my image of globalization from below. In my talk and also in my research, I've used 3 themes, which are kinship, moral economy, and everyday diplomacy. These themes are domains outside of the economical, while they of course are connected with economics. Each of these topics functions as chapters, which I already said. So yeah, now I would like to use an example of 3 people in the 3 chapters. So in Iran, I met Human. He's a 30-year-old Iranian American and claims to have returned to Tehran in order to radically change the carpet business, because he says the Iranian carpet business is old and dusty. Giving it a new direction with American taste, let's say. He grew up in New York, where most of his family members live today. Other members of his family live in Canada, Singapore, Kuwait, and also Iran. He studied banking in the US and the UK. He speaks American, English, and Farsi. His father said, my father disagrees with my plans to do this in Iran, but he still supports me. Since most Iranians do not have such a huge family network outside of Iran, which plays a significant role in my trade. In a situation of contemporary Iran, the ability to use family networks dramatically reduces the negative effects of geopolitical tensions on trade. However, these family networks require constant negotiations to function properly. Here, it's easy to assume that kinship ties are central to the production of forms of trust on which these networks rely, thereby overlooking the extent to which kinship is always an ambivalent relation. In early writing, transnational trade communities such as the one of Human's were portrayed as cultural defined. This idea of cultural defined communities leads to the assumption that trading communities are naturally trustworthy because of kinship or family ties. More recent ethnography disputes this observation, as the assumption of a trustworthy bond within these networks ignores the practices these traders maintain to have their in-group trust. Analyzing these practices reveals a nuanced and complex reality. They can be sets of shared ideas and symbols that inform human action. One such example of an ambivalent relation of kinship becomes evident from the conversations I had with Human. He uses his family companies inside Iran, Kuwait, and other countries to make his trade economically possible, since trade and money transfer with Iran are not possible normally. It took Human much effort to convince his family networks to help him doing that. As a start, he had to convince his father, who owns many of these family companies. In the beginning, his father did not understand his move to go back to Iran and pursue the carpet business. After all, his father brought him to New York and let him study in one of the best banking universities in the UK. His family left Iran for a better future in the West and were successfully doing so. Why would Human want to go back to Iran to start a business in the already dying carpet trade? Despite all doubts, Human's father gave him economic advice, which shows that these carpet traders often rely on bonds of trust and money, contesting the assumption that they are culturally bounded groups, or that kinship ties are always based on trustworthy relations. On another day, walking in the Tehran bazaar, I entered the shop of Jamshid. I knew him already before that. At the time, he was busy talking on the phone and had a stern look on his face. His friend had alcohol problems, the friend on the phone, which led to relationship issues. The friend's wife threw him out of the house. He was now homeless. The friend came to Jamshid as he had some emergency cash left in Jamshid's safe. Jamshid was busy talking on the phone, helping his friend to buy a house with that money. The economic activities of carpet traders are embedded within their evaluations of their moral lives, social modes, and identities. These evaluations are often neglected in ethnographic material on carpet traders, since most writing on carpet trade is either historical or economic. But carpet traders, not carpets themselves, often have multiple responsibilities within their social networks apart from business activities. As shown by the example of Jamshid, who helps a friend buy a house and save money for him, carpet traders often have multiple jobs and responsibilities within their direct community. Carpet traders often told me that establishing a good reputation and relation with their community is essential for their success. They are known for that. The very bond with the community is constantly reinforced by sharing tea, discussing family relations, and political issues. Often, carpet traders take great pride in being help to others. The example of Jamshid helping with money issues is especially interesting, considering the geopolitical circumstances of Iran. As local currency devalues every day, carpet traders play an increasingly important role, for example, to keeping people's money, in euros, that is. I learned that for some, storing money at a local bank is not always considered to be safe. And on yet another day in the Tehran, while driving south with Mehruz, we were heading to a business meeting. Mehruz often ignored red traffic lights and used bus lanes while driving. He assured me to not worry about the driving manners. He stated, "If police stop us, I will tell them that you are a Dutch diplomat." When I asked why he had such confidence, Mehruz quickly explained that he knows people and is involved with the government. Mehruz explained that he is involved with the development of public roads, hospitals, and universities all over Iran. He has great pride in being able to take these responsibilities for his country. Later in the business meeting, I was there and showing what Mehruz and another carpet trader were saying to each other. And at some point, Mehruz whispered to me in English, "I do not trust that guy. He's foxy. Everyone knows that. I have known him for many years. It's all a lie. He keeps the carpets that are in better shape always hidden. It is like a game. I have to study his eyes to know what his real intentions are. This man tells 11 lies in 10 words." I approached everyday diplomacy as a diplomatic practice that is under-examined in the discussion of geopolitical situations that affect everyday human life. It is the intention to focus on how the practice of everyday diplomacy requires the differences between cultures and individuals between cultures and individual actors to become blurry while not disappearing altogether. Within these boundaries, a clever diplomat who knows which words to use can redefine arguments and is flexible during disputes between certain groups. What makes everyday diplomacy risky and blurs the boundary of their behavior is that these actions can simultaneously make them be seen as traitors. As carpet traders sometimes betray their network, they continually break and recreate their ties of trust. These ties allow them to balance the rationale of maximizing economic gain while still being able to continue their transnational trade. Mehruz, in this case, his negotiation skills were also demonstrated during the meeting with the other trader. The two of them were both aware before it started that the other would conceal the truth to a certain degree before the meeting even started. Afterwards, Mehruz referred to this as the game. Later, after the negotiations, I saw them drink tea and have fun and have lunch while being friendly and engaging with one another's families. I aim to answer the question of how carpet traders value the social and cultural practice that were intertwined in the trading of carpets by following their everyday lives. To answer the question, the project focuses on the trading networks of carpet traders as they operate in Iranian bazaars and European carpet shops in the context of globalization from below. I had more examples also of the European traders, but there was no time to go through them all. But the 3 points that I have are basically, one, it's easy to assume that kinship ties are central to the production of forms of trust. The second is, to be a successful carpet trader, one is obliged to be involved with societal, cultural, and governmental systems. The third is a clever diplomat who knows which words to use, can redefine arguments, and is flexible during disputes between certain groups. What makes everyday diplomacy risky and blurs the boundaries of their behavior is that these actions can simultaneously make them be seen as traitors. That was my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
And our next speaker will be Alexis Zoto. And the title of her talk is The State of Albanian Kilims, Their Motifs and Narratives.
Good morning from Los Angeles. I would like to thank the Textile Society of America for hosting this symposium despite the pandemic. I am Alexis Zoto, and I'm delighted to share with you my research on Albanian Kilims. Although I am an academic, I am an artist first, and this research is integral to my practice as an artist. I went to Albania in the summer of 2018. I studied the Kilims in the National Archive in Tirana, Albania, and interviewed professional weavers around the country. Here, if you don't know, is a map of where Albania is. Although Albania has been part of many different empires, it has held on to its unique Indo-European language. Here is a super condensed history of Albania. As you can see, it's only been an independent country since 1912. Albania, for a long time, it was a closed police state for almost 50 years. Many people are fully traumatized by the former dictatorship. There has yet to be a truth and reconciliation process here. As you can imagine, there are big cultural differences between older and younger generations. These gaps show different knowledge bases, different understandings of history, and therefore identities. Another thing I'd like to highlight for you is the bottom bullet point, which is about the population. It is predominantly Sunni Islam with Catholic, Orthodox, and Bektashi minorities. My interest started with this book, Qëllimi Shqiptare by Rok Zoyzi, published in 1968. It is written in Albanian and translated into French and English. It has beautiful lithographs. It is interesting what information is provided and what is left out. Some regions are included and others are not, as well as descriptions of motifs are sometimes vague. It is the only Albanian publication devoted solely to Kilims, and it is a reflection of the national collection. Dr. Afrodita Onuzi, retired preeminent ethnographic scholar in Albania, defines Kilims as flat woven rug with at least one border. On the left, you may recognize the Belgrade key, and on the right is identified as in the center as a pergola or vine with grapes or flowers with a border with a motif that is often identified as a rooster. There are certainly similarities of designs from other countries in the region and countries that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. This is the archive located in Tirana, which is the capital. Lesh, which you see on the image on the left, is wool. I was told by the registrar that I was the first foreigner to look at this collection. The Kilims are organized into two and housed in two closets, the closet of the north and the closet of the south. I was not allowed to handle or photograph any Kilims. I also learned they are treated regularly with arsenic and are not in a climate-controlled environment. I would like to point out that it is only within the last 10 years or so that Albanian scholars are looking at deconstructing and critiquing how ethnography, anthropology, archaeology, and other fields of research were conducted through the lens of the former dictator Enver Hoxha. Another thing I also would like to highlight for you is the fact that the collection is dividing the country in half, north and south. At the archive, this is what I did. I sat at a desk and looked at images on a computer that was their computer. And then the registrar would look at the registry and the corresponding numbers of the digital images. The information was frustratingly inconsistent. What was most striking was, again, what was missing. Symbols and descriptions were scant and often vague, referring to motifs as geometric, even though they were radically different. The collection was also uneven, with most items from Korça. Some areas are not represented at all. Another point I would like to make is that my colleagues at the University of Tirana in the art department and others were stunned by my access to the archive, as none of them had been allowed to study there. I worked in the archive as much as they would let me during the week, and then on the weekends I went out to interview professional weavers. In addition, I interviewed a variety of scholars and collectors of textiles and traditional costumes. I also interviewed designers of Kilims in the factory system. These men identified themselves as painters. Under communism, Albania had a dozen or so factories that made handmade Kilims and rugs, mostly for export. Designs were decided in the capital, Tirana, and then distributed across the country. Women would then make these rugs and Kilims. You may notice in my map that I've circled all the places I interviewed, and then there's a big section where there's nothing circled, and that's because I couldn't secure any interviews in those areas, but I did visit churches, mosques, ethnographic museums, collecting other information, and particularly the ethnographic museum in Elbasan and Berat. This is the atelier of Flutura Mata and Kukis. An anecdote was shared with me by a local journalist saying that she was lucky because her local leader is in the same political party as the president of Albania. So she was able to get support from the government to keep this craft alive and to teach others. She also knows dyeing techniques. These women worked for her and worked with her. And Sajade is the Albanian word for rug, which is the word on the right there. This is an heirloom of fluturas, which is typical of the Kukis area. In the center of the heirloom is the double-headed eagle, which is the national symbol of Albania. This design and variations of it are in the archive, as well as you can find examples at the bazaar in Kruja. Other hallmarks of this particular design is the use of bright pink and the geometric flower that Flutura identified. I hope you can see my cursor, which is this particular flower and variations of it. Here is Nebi Chotai, who is located in Zogai, which is very close to Shkodra. She, again, this journalist shared with me, does not enjoy the support that because her local leader is not in the same political party. She was one of the few professionals that I interviewed who has a garden that she actually uses to create natural dyes. And she was one of the few weavers I met who actually learned the craft from her mother, whereas most learned in the factory system. She also identified herself as only using traditional designs. I pressed her on her knowledge, and she said she used a catalog, which turned out to be this book, published in the 1970s. Her copy is on the left and my copy is on the right. I'd like to point out that on my copy, the right side has a design that is typical of the Korça area, which is in the south. She never made any kilims with designs from the south. In my travels around Albania, the double-headed eagle is everywhere. I found it strange how everything is supposedly a double-headed eagle. It is the national symbol. It's on the flag. It was a symbol of resistance against the Ottomans. And its roots are in the Byzantine Empire, which occupied the Albanian territory before the Ottomans. It is so ubiquitous, I found myself questioning if what I was really looking at was in fact double-headed eagle, or had the original meaning of the motif been changed. So I'd like to point out here again, I hope you can see my cursor. So she's pointing out the double-headed eagle here. She identified this as an eagle, this motif here behind, and this one as well, all as double-headed eagle. In Durrës, which is, we're working our way from the north and working our way south, who is a designer I met a designer who was in the factory system, and he shared what the catalogs looked like when the factories were operating. What I found super interesting was that styles of other cultures were co-opted, like certain Persian styles of rugs made in Albania for export. I found examples of these particular styles of rugs in the Albanian diaspora communities from when they were visiting Albania during communism as tourists. Another problem I found with weavers like Shiri Kasmi is that she has no pension, even spending a lifetime working in the factory. Weavers do not make a lot of money. Kilims in Albania sell for hundreds of euros, where maybe in excuse me, in neighboring countries, kilims go for thousands of euros. Just wanted to point out more shots of the bazaar in Kruja on either side of the weaver, and her atelier and shop is in the bazaar. Here is a picture of a still operating weaving factory in Korça. And then across the street from this factory is the wool dyeing factory. These are typical designs from Korça, the left featuring the open and closed design, and then the Mosque Motif, which is, I'd like to point out, is interesting because usually there is some kind of figure inside that is somewhat representational. Weavers here identified this particular motif in the middle as a horse, and was referring to the old horse mask, which I was not able to find an actual old horse mask. And then this one, which is very common also, is the water jug or ibrik. Another thing that's very common from this area are these heavy blankets. And they're referred to in the archive as valens or lavens. People stopped making them around the 1940s, but I found many examples in the Albanian diaspora who came before Albania closed. Another important feature about these blankets is that they are felted. And you can see that the different motifs inside. And these motifs here are often identified as frogs. These kilims are made by a mother and daughter, Betty and Marita Nurce. Betty is 85, and Betty talked to me at great length about the hardships she survived. She learned to weave in the factory system. Her daughter, an epidemiologist, loves textiles and learned to weave from her mother, and now weaves in her free time. I asked her, why is the mosque symbol so prevalent here? And they told me it is an expression of our brotherhood between Orthodox and Muslim religions. Here is another kilim that has a large mosque symbol. And what I found extremely interesting is the cross at the top here and the lovely border with the birds. Albania does have many interfaith families, and I did find one example like this one in the archive. Right here is another example of the mosque symbol, but does not have a figure inside, and this was in the Ethnographic Museum in Gjirokastër. And this on the left is also very common design from that area. Here is the wheel symbol. It's common throughout this region and certainly is recognizable across the Balkans and across the former Ottoman Empire. And there's variations on this theme with different colors, different arrangements. I just wanted to share that with you. This slide is an heirloom belonging to a family in Antigoniya, which is close to the border with Greece. Everything I've showed you so far has not had much in the way of representational imagery. There are examples of representational imagery, such as people and birds in the archive, and most of them originate from Gjirokastër, again, which is in the south of Albania. And another thing I'd like to point out with this one, excuse me, I'm really sorry, is the double-headed eagle with the star, which is the communist version of the national symbol. Lastly, in keeping with the theme of the symposium, Hidden Stories, Human Lives, I would like to share with you a family heirloom from my family. This is the piece that's launched my investigation. It belonged to my great-grandmother, who was a devout Orthodox person who practiced her faith, even though that act could endanger her family. Practicing a religion could be punishable by death or having one's family imprisoned in a work camp. And the question I found myself asking was, why would such a devout Orthodox person have a kilim with mosques all over it? So this is where it all started. Lastly, I'd like to leave you with a few questions that came to my mind as I am exploring this. Was looking at claiming heritage as a political act, and certainly in the region that could certainly be very fraught. And then also about cultural appropriation in terms of what does that mean in terms of practice, and certainly looking at cultural purity and authenticity, and where does that lie in terms of cultural production and in art and domestic items. Thank you very much. This last image is from a collective in Antigoniya in the south. Appreciate your time.
Our next speaker and our final speaker of this session is Yumiko Kamada.
Yes.
And the title of her talk is Tribal Textiles and the Mingei Circle in Japan, Yanagi Muneyoshi's Views on Carpet. I just want to note also that this paper has been nominated for the Founding President's Award. So welcome, Yumiko.
Tribal carpets and textiles have been enthusiastically collected by connoisseurs and ordinary people in Europe and the United States for years. In contrast, tribal carpets and textiles have not gained much attention among the majority of Japanese. However, some Japanese, especially Muneyoshi Yanagi and his friends in the Mingei circle, have been collecting tribal carpets and textiles since the mid-20th century. This paper focuses on this little-known fact and explores how and in what circumstances these textiles were collected. In addition, this paper examines why carpets and tribal textiles were highly valued by the Mingei circle and compares their view with William Morris's attitudes toward Oriental carpets. From the 1870s onwards, Carpets from Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, and India were collected by European museums as a subject of study and as a source of design for the applied arts. Alongside this interest in Oriental carpets, there were frequent exhibitions and large-scale publications on carpets. At that time, Persian carpets were viewed as the most valuable. However, from the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century, some people started to collect tribal carpets for the purpose of interior embellishment. For instance, Swedish aristocrat Wilhelmina von Holwell purchased Turkmen bags in Berlin and used them as textiles for furnishings. Similarly, a Scottish businessman, William Robert Reed, used a Turkmen tent band for the curtain rails in the castle he purchased in 1902. Not only Europeans, but also Americans collected tribal carpets. James Franklin Ballard collected a variety of carpets, including Turkmen carpets that were not that popular in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, several handy guidebooks on carpets were published in which tribal carpets were also introduced. This kind of guidebook illustrated how to use tribal carpets as a part of the interior. This fashion is also evident in a picture of a New York businessman Arthur Irwin taken around 1930. As discussed elsewhere by myself, Indian and Persian carpets were brought to Edo period Japan by the Dutch East India Company and used for special occasions such as the Kyoto Gion Festival. Catalogues of art auctions held in Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo at the beginning of the 20th century indicate that several dominant figures and wealthy merchants owned 18th and 19th century Indian carpets from the Edo period. However, while Japanese people were gradually exposed to the use of carpet because of the westernization process that occurred after the Meiji period, very few had the opportunity to see Oriental carpets firsthand. From the early 20th century, only a privileged few, such as aristocrats, scholars, and businessmen, had the chance to visit Europe and the United States and become exposed to carpets as daily furnishings. For instance, as shown in a photograph taken in 1914, a famous Japanese novelist, Natsume Soseki, cherished a large Oriental carpet and used it in his library. Probably, this is because Soseki learned how Europeans used Oriental carpets as interior decoration during his stay in England in 1900 to 1902. Similarly, a businessman, Shotaro Kaga, traveled around Europe in 1910, and after his return, he used Oriental carpets in his English-style villa. Moritatsu Hosokawa, who was born into a noble family of marquis rank, also used Oriental carpet at home. Hosokawa had the chance to travel in Europe in 1920s to view and study various artworks, especially Middle Eastern art, such as Persian paintings and pottery. He purchased Oriental carpets and Persian ceramics and brought them back to Japan. It seems that by the 1920s, a small number of people who had the privilege and means to travel to Europe could own Oriental carpets. From the 1920s onward, several books on carpets were published in Japan, and some of them explain how to use Oriental carpets as interior decoration. For instance, a 1938 book on interior by Shinpei Masuyama introduces Turkish, Persian, Indian, and Chinese hand-woven carpets as the most artistic types of floor spread. However, most Japanese were unfamiliar with carpets at that time. It was in this context that Muneyoshi Yanagi found beauty in carpet designs and came to regard carpets and textile and tribal textiles as idealized artifacts. Yanagi was born in 1889, and after graduating from the University of Tokyo in 1913, he pursued his thought on art and religious philosophy. From the mid-1920s, he named artifacts made by anonymous craftsmen as Mingei and promoted the Mingei movement with potters Kanjiro Kawai and Shoji Hamada. In 1929 to 1930, after he had visited England and other places in Europe, Yanagi went to America and worked as a lecturer at Harvard University. After his return to Japan, he published a journal entitled Koge in 1931 and established the Japan Folk Crafts Museum in Tokyo. Throughout his lifetime, Yanagi traveled not only to various places in Japan, but also extensively in Asia, Europe, and America. During his travels, he collected a variety of artifacts that he later exhibited. Until his death in 1961, he was energetically engaged in conducting research, collecting, and writing. In a 1942 article entitled "The Teaching of Artifacts," Yanagi stated that nature and history are the necessary elements for great artifacts. In that article, he explained that nature indicates climate, geographical change, and the types of material, while history includes changes in lifestyles, customs, and manners, and the continuation of knowledge and techniques. At the same time, Yanagi used nature to mean without contrivance. Interestingly, in his 1939 article on print art, Yanagi refers to carpet as an artifact that follows the principle of nature and therefore accomplishes superior design. He explains that because of the material and the simple weave structure of carpet, it is often difficult to make curvilinear lines. However, this limitation caused by the material and the process of weaving contributes to the beauty of carpets. In other words, working within such limitations or following the nature is indispensable in the making of beautiful artifacts. Similarly, in a 1942 article on design, Yanagi stated that while design is produced by a human being's technique, design should apply the principle of nature. According to Yanagi, the limitation caused by purpose, material, and technique are indispensable in good design. Indeed, he acclaims carpets because of the design limitation imposed by the methods of weaving. In the 1950s, Yanagi actually used a woven bag made by a Persian nomad as a cushion in his library. At the time, it was difficult to obtain such tribal goods in Japan, and it seems that Yanagi purchased the bag sometime during his travels in Europe and America in 1950s. The reason why he preferred this bag may well have been because tribal carpets possess all the characteristics of artifacts that Yanagi advocated. In a 1941 article entitled "The Characteristics of the Beauty of Artifacts," he employs the following words to describe the characteristics of artifacts: practical, repetitive, that means produce same objects in large number, and inexpensive, public, canonical, that means based on traditional method, design, anonymous, indirect, that means far from contrivance, and not flexible, that means restriction imposed by purpose, material, and process. For a long time, tribal carpets were woven by the female members of a family, and they were decorated with traditional designs. These anonymous tribal carpets were woven to fit the daily life of the nomad and were therefore both practical and simple. When Yanagi came across this woven bag, given his view on design, he must have regarded it as an ideal artifact. If Yanagi had lived in the current era, it is very likely that he would have been an eminent collector of tribal carpets and textiles. However, because of limited accessibility to such objects in Japan during his lifetime, Yanagi owned just a few tribal textiles. In Japan, Yanagi was a pioneer in praising the beauty of the textiles woven by nomads, indigenous Taiwanese, and Africans. At the same time, he asked textile weavers of the day to reflect on their works. For instance, in 1943, he praised the textiles woven by the indigenous people of Taiwan, stating that they were as sophisticated as those in Shosoin and that the best contemporary weavers could not produce textiles of comparable quality. Yanagi's this view on artifacts and carpets reminds us of the attitudes of William Morris to art and carpet. Morris was active as a designer, thinker, and social activist, and tried to bring about resurgence of people's art that had flourished in the Middle Ages. Morris's work were introduced to Japan from the mid-Meiji period onward, and in this regard, Yanagi wrote that, thanks to John Ruskin and William Morris, the field of craft was raised to become the important subject of beauty. And in 1929, Yanagi visited Kilims House, the London home of Morris, from 1878 till his death. Morris also weighed heavily on nature. He wrote, "For, and this is at the root of the whole matter, everything made by man's hands has a form which must be either beautiful or ugly. Beautiful if it is in accord with nature and helps her, ugly if it is discordant with nature and thwarts her. It cannot be indifferent." Furthermore, Morris's thought on materials and their limitation is incomparable to that expressed in Yanagi's above-mentioned observation on design, as exemplified by the following extract on the slide, especially at the middle. The special limitations of the material should be a pleasure to you, and at the end, it is the pleasure in understanding the capabilities of a special material and using them for suggesting natural beauty and incident that gives the raison d'etre of decorative art. Morris also had strong interest in Oriental carpets, using Persian carpets in the so-called Red House, where he lived from 1860. Also, in a letter to his daughter May in 1876, he reported his recent purchase of a Persian carpet. He wrote, "I saw yesterday a piece of ancient Persian, time of Shah Abbas, that fairly threw me on my back. I had no idea that such wonders could be done in carpets." In fact, as with Yanagi, Morris used Persian carpet in his daily life. For instance, the wall of the dining room at Kilims House was beautifully decorated with a 17th century Persian carpet. At the same time, Oriental carpets inspired Morris's work as a designer. From 1879, Morris himself weaved the so-called Hammersmith carpet while residing at Kilims House, and this carpet is clearly influenced by both Persian and Indian carpets. As we have seen, both Yanagi and Morris highly valued Oriental carpets and used them in their daily life. For them, such carpets and other objects made by nomads were idealized artifacts. However, in Japan, it was difficult to obtain carpets, especially tribal carpets. Therefore, in 1964, when Yanagi's son, Munemoto Yanagi, accidentally came across some bags woven by nomads during his research in Turkey, he became fascinated by their beauty and introduced this type of nomadic textile in the journal Mingei. After World War II, Oriental carpets, including tribal carpets, were collected by Keisuke Serizawa, Shoji Hamada, and Tonomura Kichinosuke, who were close to Yanagi and promoted the Mingei movement. Whenever they had the chance to travel abroad, they purchased foreign artifacts and introduced them to Japanese audiences through exhibitions and publications. Serizawa was a world-famous textile designer. He started his career as an industrial designer, and after he met Yanagi in 1927, Serizawa became heavily involved with the Mingei movement. In his later years, whenever he had the chance to go abroad, he purchased foreign artifacts and textiles and became an extensive collector. Among them are carpets, bags, and textiles made by nomads in Iran, Turkey, Caucasus, and Afghanistan. Serizawa not only received inspiration from these textiles, but also enjoyed them as interior decoration. Shoji Hamada was a world-famous potter and a close friend of Yanagi and Serizawa. As early as 1920, he went to England to study pottery in London and then visited Egypt on his return trip to Japan in 1924. In 1929, Hamada again went to London, this time with Yanagi, to hold an exhibition and also traveled around Europe to collect a variety of artifacts and handicrafts. His experiences with traveling abroad opened his eyes to foreign cultures and art forms, including Islamic art. Hamada collected various artifacts, including textiles from Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, India, Africa, South America, and Taiwan. He stated that the reason why I collected what I liked is because these are the food selected by my eyes to nourish my mind. Thus, it is clear that Hamada collected these pieces to gain inspiration for his creative output. Kichinosuke Tonamura was a textile artist and became the director of the Kurashiki Museum of Folk Art in 1948. Tonamura tried to disseminate Yanagi's thought and spirit through writing, collecting, and exhibitions. In 1957, he traveled to 14 countries in Europe and collected a wide range of artifacts. His book introduces a variety of items, including tent bands made by Iranian nomads and Turkish and Persian Kilims. In Europe, Oriental carpets, including tribal carpets, were used as interior decoration from the late 19th century. American collectors also found beauty in Oriental carpets. In the early 20th century, Yanagi and other privileged scholars, businessmen, and artists had the opportunity to visit Europe and America and learn about the tradition of using carpet as an interior furnishing. Some of them brought carpets back to Japan. For Yanagi, carpet was one of the idealized handicrafts that realized the principle of art and nature that he espoused. As demonstrated in this paper, his attitude toward carpet was similar to that of William Morris, who also highly valued Oriental carpets and gained inspiration from them. Yanagi's friends and followers in the Mingei movement, such as Keisuke Serizawa, Shoji Hamada, and Kichinosuke Tonamura, also collected carpets as idealized handicrafts and as a source of inspiration. Yanagi wished to make the world more beautiful, and he wanted to show that it was impossible to understand beauty without daily life. On the other hand, Morris said that he should not put things in our homes that are not useful or beautiful. It is interesting that both of them valued and used Oriental carpet in their daily life. Thus, it could be said that carpet is the object that exemplifies the thought of both Yanagi and Morris on the idealized beauty to be found in handicrafts. Thank you very much.
We have some questions. I think the first two are for Alexis. Let me open the question. Jen Spope asks, were the Albanian factories privately owned?
No, they were created it was a communist system, so it was owned by the government. And now there's only one really that's a proper factory, and that's privately owned.
Thank you. The second question is a little related to that, but do you know, let's see, can you explain the factory system you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely.
And you did say they're already government run, so maybe you can elaborate on the system.
They were government run during the dictatorship under Enver Hoxha. And there, at the height, there were about a dozen of them across Albania. And basically there were thousands of women employed and taught to weave, and for this enormous export business where they were not only creating different kinds of designs that they thought were sellable, but they also co-opted styles from other countries, like I had mentioned, a more Persian style. Another thing I'd like to, if I may, share an interesting anecdote from somebody, a weaver that I interviewed in Kalaya. She talked about how a visit from, I think it was Stalin. It was a big Russian political figure who came to Albania, and they had woven kilims with a kilim gift that had, Lenin and other figures in, no, it was Khrushchev, excuse me. It was Khrushchev who came to visit, and so Stalin was on it, Lenin, a bunch of other figures, and he took it and then folded it and then proceeded to then sit on it. And the women were so aghast, and they immediately wanted to laugh, but they were frightened and wouldn't allow themselves to laugh because they thought they might get in trouble. So the conditions in which this system worked were extremely difficult. There was no freedom. They had certain quotas. They weren't paid unless they met those. They worked crazy long hours. I heard a lot of incredible stories of survival from a lot of these women that I interviewed. Does that answer the question?
Another question for you. Someone's got a question. How do Albanians use their carpets in their home? Are they on the floor? Are they draped on furniture?
Thank you for that question. Traditionally, during more Ottoman times, the most beautiful kilim was used in the guest room, which is where was mainly used for men to serve their guests, visiting guests. But they were used both on the floor, on seated areas. And then there were kilims, but they were basically the same kind of technique, but were cradle covers and other kinds of domestic uses for that kind of weaving. And then, like I mentioned, in the South, they were felted blankets that were also using the similar technique. And now they are, there's a very different attitude about them because of this strange moment in terms of generational differences between people who survived the dictatorship and younger generations because of, I guess I would say it's my hypothesis in interviewing many people that a lot of the folk culture, whether it was folk dancing and other kinds of craft, were kind of used and kind of shoved down people's throats in a lot of ways, and kind of got the sense of sort of nation building and putting forward a narrative. And so younger people have no concept of how back this tradition reaches. And, if you can look at, for example, the Marubi archive, which has, is a famous photographer in Albania during the Ottoman times who was photographing people and using kilims as a background. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off topic. I just realized. But there's a real disconnect. My point is between older and younger generations, and understanding history and understanding crafts that are locally made. Thank you.
Felix, next question is for you. Did you encounter any women involved in the carpet trade in your research?
That's a very good question, actually. Thank you. No, I don't. As a trader, as a, like no, actually not. In the bazaars in Iran, they were all men. And actually also most of them in Europe. Yeah, no. There's certainly no one, no women I used in my research for sure, but no.
That's probably not a surprise.
No, it is. But
and even doing your kind of research probably was easier for you as a man to kind of engage in conversations with traders and architects.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have plenty of time. If there are any other questions, please. Oh, yeah, here's one. Carol Beer, Yumiko, superb paper. I really enjoyed learning about the relationship between Morris and Mingei movement. So many connections you've explored and uncovered. Thank you. So not a question, but a comment.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Another question comes from Michelle Hopkins. Yumiko, we know quite a bit about how European designs was influenced by the opening of Japanese ports. My question is, how did Japanese design shift? It's a little bit different. That's a big question.
Repeat the question. What European design in what carpet?
Yeah, that is kind of a major question. So can you see the question? It's saying, it's really asking, we know how European design was influenced by the opening of Japan, but she's asking about the opposite of that, how Japanese design shifted. But that's a pretty big question.
You mean Japanese design in carpet?
Michelle, if you want to add to this, there's not really much of a Japanese carpet collection, design movement, is there much?
Did you see any shift in Japanese design as a result of the exchange? What do you mean by Japanese design in textile in general, or carpet, or Japanese art in general? I think that's a really big kind of broad question.
Yeah, maybe in theory, but I think you addressed that. The theory
could you please specify the media?
Carol Beer says, I think it was more of Japanese theory of design is probably where we're really focused on that. And you did address the fact that they were, looking at this material and it was very influential to this Mingei group.
Yes, after Japan opened the country, after the Meiji period, Japanese people tried to learn Western design enthusiastically. So yes, Japanese introduced Western design to modify traditional design, but some people tried to preserve traditional design. So yes, that kind of thing has happened. But for the carpet design, what I'm talking today, I focused on the tribal carpets brought back by the Japanese people who went abroad. And this kind of design inspired some artists, especially around the Mingei movement. But I think these tribal carpets and textiles didn't have big influence into the Japanese traditional art and design. Am I answering your question?
I think you've gotten at it. We have a few more questions here. One for James. Mary Tuma would like to know, do you find similar symbolism in carpets through the Middle East?
That's a very good question. It needs a very long answer, but as an example, the Baluchi carpets of Afghanistan and Khorasan province are highly symbolical and very philosophically meaningful. Turkish carpets have gone through quite an evolution in the 20th century. There was a total disruption in the 1910s and 1920s when the carpet industry was more or less controlled by Greeks and Armenians, and there was a total disruption. And I find it does not have symbolic meaning in the sense that I would use the term. And Pakistan didn't have a carpet tradition. It was introduced as a commercial enterprise 50 and 60 years ago. So there's nothing that really compares to the Persian carpet in the large sense. Afghanistan carpets, yes, but that's part of the Persian cultural sphere. And Turkmen carpets, or Tajikistan and so on, yes. But really the center is Iran. And talking about the symbolism of carpet designs, I quoted from Ford, his book in 1981, what matters is whether carpet design works as a design, and the whole principle of attaching meaning or symbolism to the motifs is highly suspect. Perhaps you recognize the name Ford because he just recently won the book prize, didn't he, from the Textile Society for ethnographical textile interest. And here is his book, which is a magnificent piece of scholarship, but he stayed true to his the Persian carpet design, the Persian carpet tradition. And if you notice, he illustrates, I think it's a 17th century carpet, and he illustrates the medallion on the cover. And this is just derived from the double square. There's Sufism deeply into that design. And this is something that he completely neglects. Sufism, the possibility of symbolic interpretations as well. So there's another book that remains to be written, going back. He surveys the Persian carpet design development from 1400 almost to the present. So it's a very, very valuable source. But from my point of view, it's extremely limited in what I consider important, the philosophical meaningfulness of these designs, the cultural and philosophical meaningfulness. I could give another example, published 5 years ago, Louise Mackey's book, Symbols of Power, which again is an amazing work of scholarship. Louise Mackey is very well known to the Textile Society. And this is a longer survey of Islamic textiles from 700 to the present. But again, I didn't find any mention of Sufism. And Symbols of Power, I referred to that in the last carpet that I looked at, the Imogli Mashhad carpet, which I consider, it functions as a symbol of power for the king, but the reverse meaning is it's a symbol of powerlessness before the divine majesty. So it has the animal skin, the polished heart of the dervish at the center. So I think much more work needs to be done on the philosophical meaningfulness of Persian carpet design.
Thank you. I have two questions here for Yumiko. They're sort of somewhat related. Are Islamic tribal weavings used in Japanese interiors today? Have there been revivals in the interest since the early and mid 20th century? And this sort of relates to another question saying, how widely have Oriental textiles stayed as an interest and more accessible? Are they accessible to the general population since the time of Muneyoshis?
So,
Yumiko, you're muted. Excuse me. Yes, today people can buy tribal carpets, textiles using internet, of course. But back in 1990s, there was some sort of a boom in Kilims in Japan. So many magazines featuring Kilims and how to use Kilims in interior. But there was a big time gap between the time of Yanagi in 1950s, 60s to 1990s. But even today, there are some small exhibitions on tribal carpets and textiles. So now, yes, it's accessible, and because of internet, people can use eBay or something like that to obtain textiles. But in Japan, there are not that big market for textiles, I think, tribal textiles. Not that people know that much about tribal carpets and textiles. So I'd like to promote the beauty of tribal carpets in Japan. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. A question for Alexis. The Kilims and carpets woven today in Albania, are they woven in the mountains or remote villages? Is there a tradition of buyers traveling into the quote backcountry to select carpets for the next stage of sale?
Thank you for that question. There is weaving going on, but there's a lot of home weavers. For this last trip that I made was basically to focus on professional weavers. And I am aware that there are home weavers in more remote areas. There also has, there is an interest in Kilims from the Balkans, but as many of you may already know, that other countries such as Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria have all done a much better job documenting that practice, whereas Albania is really kind of behind in that. But yes, that is actually my next, hopefully, trip to do research, to meet with home weavers in more remote areas, and also areas that were not covered in the archive. Thank you.
Alexis, a sort of part two. How much of Albanian kilim production do you come across for export or domestic use? And is there a difference in motifs between the two?
I would say that more recently, more contemporary made things are kind of a mishmash of everything. And you can see that in the bazaar. It's really catering to a lot of different kinds of people. The professional weavers I met are often given, designs that they then translate onto the loom. One thing that one weaver shared with me from Korcha was that she was really uncomfortable because somebody asked her to do a traditional design that was from that region in non-traditional colors, and it made her very uncomfortable. But there's definitely a strict adherence in sort of talking about traditional and then really referencing these particular books and catalogs that were from the time of the dictator. So there's not as much scholarship and understanding of what was before that and what was the tradition before that. And so again, that's another area of research that I hope to do, and also to encourage others, if they're interested, to research, is also what is in the diaspora communities, Albanian diaspora communities across the globe, really, to sort of see what we can find. Did that answer the question?
Yes. Back to Yumiko again. Thanks so much for your superb paper. You compared the attitudes of William Morris and Yanagi towards Oriental carpets. The former was involved mostly on imperial artisan work from Persia, while the latter on tribal. What do you think about the difference?
That's very good point. Yes, William Morris focused on Safavid carpet, very high quality one. And as you know, Ardabil carpets were purchased by Biennial because of Morris's advice. Yes, but William Morris also, I believe, highly valued nomads carpets, because he said that nomadic Kurd can make something much more beautiful than modern craftsmen make. This is a citation from William Morris. So he said, nomadic Kurd made something much more beautiful than modern craftsmen can make. So this phrase indicates that William Morris always also pay attention to nomadic Kurd's craft and prized them, I believe. And at that time already, V&A Victorian Albert Museum collected some nomadic carpets and textiles. So I'm sure William Morris saw them. However, he could afford to purchase high quality 17th century carpet. But for Yanagi, he could see such carpets in London, of course, because he visited England many times and he went to V&A. So he could see such high quality imperial Persian carpet, but he could not purchase such high quality imperial carpet. And William Morris is a little bit 2 generations older than Yanagi. So at the time of Yanagi, it's impossible to purchase 17th century imperial Persian carpets. That's why their choice of carpet is different. However, William Morris also left some notes on nomadic cruise crafts and prized them. So I think both of them highly prized crafts by nomads. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of comments here from Louise Mackey. Congratulations to all 4 speakers. Very interesting papers. And on the broad scope, we learned a great deal. Thank you all. Sherry Hunter was really referencing, Felix, your paper about your observations of someone calling another trader like suspiciously and foxy, just really noting that maybe that was not exclusive just carpet dealers, but really emphasizing that family, bonds and really about, within this sort of group, if you want to respond to that at all.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. And I've built upon the research of Magnus Marsden, and he did a lot of research on how people trade in Afghanistan and Tajikistan and other countries around it. So yes, most definitely, it's not just exclusive to carpet dealers, but like any trade, even also in Europe, people, even within their families, conceal some elements, or they say certain things, or they exclude certain other things. So yeah, for sure.
I have another question for you, Felix. In your research with the carpet traders, on average, how long have they been in the trade? Is it the lifelong career, or are they involved in simultaneously other trades and industries? Is it something?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I didn't really talk about the European side of my research because I did both, let's say. So I talked to many traders in Iran in actually Dutch, my own language, and also German a lot, and of course English, and sometimes also a little bit in Farsi. But many of them actually traveled to Europe. They did a PhD actually in some kind of carpet design, or they had a long family network or business for some of them even 30 years. So yeah, many of them had other jobs. As I said, some of them were in the government, or yeah, many other things.
Great, thank you. I have 2 questions for James. Can you please tell me the name of your most current work discussing the topic of your presentation? Is that your publication that you were holding up?
That's actually a very short list. I'd be happy to send a PDF of the talk with proper illustrations if anybody gets in contact with me. And the best way to get in contact is to go to the website tabar.ca, Tabar.ca. And that's the website for the book that I co-authored, The Persian Carpet, The Vision of a Whole People. And I co-authored with Iraj Narai. And on that website, there's a link to a talk that I gave to the Textile Society American Conference 10 years ago in Lincoln, Nebraska, Zahir Baten, Outer Form and Inner Meaning in Iranian Textile Designs. If you Google Zahir Baten, it'll pop up. And
I would remind folks too that they can contact you through our Crowd Compass app. Everyone's sort of accessible. So,
but if you go to tabar.ca, there's an email address that comes to me, info@tabar.ca. Tabar is the ritual axe of the dervish, T-A-B-R. It's a 2-edged axe which cuts through all dualities to reveal the unity behind appearances. So that has a philosophical meaning too.
James, we have another question for you from Louise Mackey. Thank you for your presentation. I was especially interested in your comments about the dual nature in garden carpets of flowers during the day and scents by night. Can you provide additional comments?
Well, the garden is a Golistan and a Bustan, which not coincidentally are the titles of two famous books by Sadi, the 13th century Persian writer and poet. And by that, he's expressing this fundamental duality, the fundamental duality of sight and vision. Spectacular flowers during the day and at night. And the Persian night, historically, was very dark, as you could imagine. And the stars were an overwhelming display. And the Hoz Mahi that I pointed out, the fish pool at the center of the ideal garden, becomes a mirror, doesn't it? Which reflects the cosmic pattern, which of course is the divine pattern. So it plays the same role as the medallion for me in the traditional medallion and cornice design. I'm getting away from the garden, but if you ask in Iran, you see a medallion and cornice design, you ask, what's the name of that design, or what is that design? Most commonly, they'll say it's the Lochak Torange design. And what does that mean? Torange is a citrus fruit like a tangerine, and quite distinct from carpet. And Lochak is a woman's head covering. You throw it over when the men come around. It's out of fashion now, but it had a serrated edge. And so that's the corners, the four corners. So you're saying that that design, which is the most famous Persian carpet design, is the old woman's head covering tangerine design. Now, clearly that's not the deep meaning of it, is it? And that is to avoid discussion. It's very embarrassing to get into a discussion of Sufism. You know, under the Pahlavis, that was discouraged. We're a modern country here. We don't have that anymore. And under the present regime, it's also discouraged because people who follow Sufism don't necessarily follow the dogmas of Islam, the strict observances. They're rather freer than that. So it is not the Lochak Torange design. It's the animal skin of the dervish, the pustine, and the polished heart of the dervish, the essence of the dervish. So at least it is for me, and I hope I've convinced a few people today that that is the best way to look at it. Otherwise, go back to the old woman's head covering tangerine design if you want to.
Just a comment from Louise Mackey to follow up on that Carol Beer and Louise will be showing the Jaipur garden carpet this afternoon in session 10C, India in situ. So FYI for those who are interested in seeing that as well. I think we have just one final, maybe more questions. We have two more questions. Alexis, is there, when did the double-headed eagle come into use in Albania? Was it just always in your research? Did you find it present there?
Hey, Cherry. I see that's her question. There's a short answer and a long answer. Basically, there is a scholar in Albania, Jaho Brahaj, who wrote a book solely on this matter. I have not been able to fully get through it because I am not fluent in Albanian, but I hope to totally get through it. But most people that I've talked to tend to say that it was Byzantine, but as we all know, that symbol is all over the place and it's not unique to any one place. So, but like I said, I would look to Jaho Brahaj's book on that, but it's only published in Albanian as I know right now. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have two final questions here. I do have to remind you folks that we have a hard deadline at noon. The room will shut down because we have a keynote speaker coming up, a plenary session speaker coming up. So, but let's try to squeeze in some more questions here. Yumiko, these are for you. Thank you for your excellent presentation. One, could you please explain about Yanagi's invitation and experience as a lecturer at Harvard? What did he lecture about and what did he think about his experience in the US? Is the first question.
for the first question, he was invited to Harvard to make lecture on Japanese art. So yes, the lecture is about the history of Japanese art.
Do we know anything about his experiences being in the US? How did he react to being at Harvard?
Yes, actually, he wrote his experience in the US. He did his best to prepare his lectures, and he worried about his lecture, but he said all the students are very nice to him, and he got good feedback from American students, and he said that's a kind of very special experience, and that kind of things are written by himself in his kind of diary. And I really enjoy, because I check whole writings by Yanagi Muneyoshi to find the specific sentences related to tribal carpets and textiles. So I read whole amount of his writings. It was like 15 volumes of something, and completely written in Japanese. And it was great joy, fun. And so that's my answer for question number 1. And for question number 2, a young Japanese craft people inspired by Mingei philosophy able to make a viable living through. That's a difficult question. I think it's really difficult, but they try to somehow survive. But the good thing is these days, Japanese people try to prize crafts made under the Mingei movement. There are kind of revival of enjoying some crafts made under the leadership of the Mingei movement. So I hope those craftsmen can survive and can get enough living. They can earn enough money to survive their life.
I think that's all our questions for today. Thank you all so much. Please, it was wonderful to have you panelists. This was really educational and fantastic. And thank you again, audience, for being here. And we will let you go and resume with the plenary session with Jolene Ricards. Thank you.